The state of Czechoslovakia was carved out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of World War I. It was unique within the context of Central Europe because it had a relatively developed and prosperous democracy. In 1938 and 1939, however, it was divided up by Germany, Poland, and Hungary, and suffered the hardships of Nazi occupation during World War II. After World War II, the Czech government that was agreed on and recognized by the Allies contained several political parties. The Communist Party had jurisdiction over the police and the military. Soviet forces were withdrawn in 1945 and elections were held in May 1946. The National Front of Communists and Socialists won the majority of the votes, and thus communism had taken seed in Czechoslovakia.
Tight Soviet control, according to Stalin, meant the establishment of one-party rule, the implementation of Soviet-style five-year plans, and the integration of the economies of Eastern Europe with that of the USSR. The Soviet attempt to seize and consolidate Czechoslovakia started with the Czechoslovakian coup that took place in 1948. Unfortunately for Soviet Russia, Czechoslovakia as a whole was leaning towards Western ideals, including expressing interest in receiving aid from the Marshall Plan. This tendency towards Western leaning did not sit well with the Soviets, and they organized pressure on the coalition government, forcing 12 non-communist members to resign. The Czech Communist Party leader demanded that a communist-led government was formed in Czechoslovakia. With this pressure from Moscow, along with the threats of military intervention, the president of Czechoslovakia, Eduard Beneš, agreed to the communist-run government. Despite this agreement, the Czech foreign minister, Jan Masaryk, was found dead under unusual consequences that seemed to point toward a serious Soviet intervention. These bloody dismals of non-communists continued in Czechoslovakia.
The first years of communist rule brought enormous change to Czechoslovakia. Beginning in 1948, the communists deepened the nationalization program and embraced the collectivization of agriculture. The regime also quickly began a purge of political enemies in the state apparatus, military, and individuals with leading roles in the economy. These purges were followed by the trials, imprisonments, and occasional executions of those deemed opposed to the new regime.
The Czech government kept tight control over the Czechoslovak citizenry for the next 15 years, using the secret police as necessary to enforce their rule. Public protest was limited, partially due to the relative success, by communist standards, of Czechoslovakia's economy. By improving the standard of living, Czechoslovakia avoided the political turmoil experienced in both Poland and Hungary. It was against this backdrop of general order and the absence of de-Stalinization that Czech President Novotný created a new constitution in 1960. It further centralized decision-making and declared that socialism had been achieved, and the state's name was formally changed to the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic to reflect this.
The Warsaw Treaty Organization, or Warsaw Pact, was created on May 14, 1955, by Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and the German Democratic Republic, Poland, the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was one of the most important members of the pact and had a very close relationship with the Soviet Union. In 1974, the country even stated in their constitution that Czechoslovakia will be forever and irreversibly be allied with the Soviet Union. Even so, the first main challenge to the Warsaw Pact was because of Czechoslovakia.
Stalin's death in 1953 had little effect on Czechoslovakia. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, was not fully supported by the Czechs. Like hardline communist leaders in East Germany, officials in Prague did not embrace Nikita Khrushchev's efforts at liberalization and pluralism. His successor, Leonid Brezhnev, was even less disposed to allow for experimentation. The authoritarian ruler of Czechoslovakia during Leonid Brezhnev's tenure as the leader of the USSR, Antonin Novotný, and severe economic problems caused dissatisfaction among Czech citizens. On January 5, 1968, Novotný was pressured to resign as the first secretary of the Communist Party, and he was replaced by Alexander Dubček. Dubček was preferred originally by the Soviets because they could pressure him into doing what they wanted, though he was later disapproved of because of his reform program and leadership style. The Soviets forced him to reinstate censorship over the mass media, silence critical intellectuals, and remove the bold reformers from the party. He started the movement that is referred to as Prague Spring. It aimed to create socialism with a human face. Dubček tried to modernize the economy by expanding trade with the West. He also abolished censorship. However, he remained conscious of what happened in Hungary in 1956. Therefore, he remained careful to ensure that the USSR and Czechoslovakia would remain in the Warsaw Pact and stay a valuable ally. Later, however, Dubček was taken to Moscow, where the Soviets decided that they would purge the government ministries and party radicals in the Czechoslovakian Communist Party.
On April 16, 1968, a Central Committee adopted the Action Program, spearheaded by Dubček, which reaffirmed the Communist Party as the established leader in Czechoslovakia. The program also accepted other political parties. However, they did not advocate for policies that would threaten Soviet security interests. The Soviets perceived these actions to be a liberalization movement, and this created tension between the two nations. The Soviets believed that it was time to intervene, and they were supported by both East Germany and Poland. From August 20th to the 21st of the same year, Soviet armies from many of the countries within the Warsaw Pact took over Prague and other prominent Czechoslovakian cities. Czechoslovakia was occupied within 24 hours because of the surprise military invasion and lack of resistance. This event led to the reunification of the Warsaw Treaty.
Dubček was replaced by Gustav Husak, who had led the reformist wing of the Slovakian Communist Party just before the invasion. He was also known for suppressing displays of dissent, as expected by Moscow. Within the USSR, the rise of Gorbachev in 1985 alarmed the Czech Communist Party. The hardline communist leaders of Czechoslovakia did not embrace Gorbachev's brand of new thinking. They persistently held onto their strict rule while the economy began to skid. Gorbachev's first official visit to Czechoslovakia in 1987 raised hopes and fears that he would call for a resurrection of the 1968 reforms. Instead, however, he made rather plain comments that relieved the Czech leaders. Meanwhile, Husak was forced to resign in December 1987, and only small amounts of reform were attempted at this time. He was succeeded by Miloš Jakeš, an old Stalinist. Jakeš, however, could not halt the growing pressure for reform. The regime held out against legitimate reform for as long as possible. The breaching of the Berlin Wall in 1989, in the meantime, acted as a catalyst for reform. Demonstrations that advocated for a change in political structures broke out in several cities and were relatively nonviolent. Therefore, the movement was known as the Velvet Revolution. It led to the creation of two parties that were set up in opposition to the current regime, the Civic Forum in Prague and the Public Against Violence in Slovakia. The current leadership resigned, and eventually the opposition finally realized their goals of reform. 23 parties ran for office in the general election of June 1990, and the Civic Forum and the Public Against Violence won convincingly. The Warsaw Pact nations, including the USSR, issued a statement condemning the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia as illegal and promised never again to interfere with the country's internal affairs again.
The Soviet Union never directly held power in Czechoslovakia. They did, however, have extreme influences in deciding who their leaders were and how their government was run. Control was established through the Czech coup of 1948 and consolidated through events such as the creation of the Warsaw Pact. Their consolidation can be witnessed through the outcomes of Prague Spring and through the control the USSR had in the shaping of Czech domestic policy. Censorship over the media, the use of fear to instill subordination in its citizens, the removal of non-communist members from government, and the centralized planning of the economy were all characteristics of a single-party state embraced by Czechoslovakia. When opposition was expressed through the ridding of censorship and the acceptance of other political parties, the USSR took military action against the Czechs
that helped communist rule last until its eventual breakdown in 1990.